For some mix advice, there's a few things that I can go over. One, and probably the most dangerous thing, is don't overcompress the mix. Don't overlimit it. Don't just crush it. There's a tendency for some mix engineers to make the mix as loud as possible so that they can feel like they are commercially viable or commercially competitive compared to releases that other artists have already mastered. When a mix engineer has spent weeks on a mix, they're emotionally attached to it and they know it in and out, and sometimes it's hard to be as objective as they really should or need to be. For a mastering engineer to hear a new mix for the first time, there's total objectivity, fresh pair of ears, and the mastering engineer can automatically detect if there's something wrong. Sometimes those kinds of things can slip from a mix engineer's ears. Sometimes the monitoring situation makes a big difference, and this is one of the reasons why the industry always suggests have somebody else master your music. Don't try to master it yourself. But the biggest thing is don't crush your mix. Just make it sound wonderful. Make it sound as good as you want it to sound when you crank it up. Don't worry about the level. That's my job. I can bring it up to a commercially viable and a competitive level and not compromise the mix too much. So this is where the experience of a mastering engineer knows how to do that without placing too much compromise on the mix or crushing it. Another thing related to that is don't clip your mix, because sometimes as I'm mastering, the first set of processes that I run the mix through may emphasize or expose the clipping sound. And if I clip on the master, then it's gonna double that exposure, and we don't want it to sound clip. We want to clip in the correct way. Do try and balance your kick drum with your bass drum judiciously. And what I mean by that is that the kick drum doesn't sit on top of the bass and the bass doesn't sit on top of the kick drum. You want them both to sound like they're in the same room. This is one of the hardest things to get right in a mix, and it's also hard to get right in a master, especially if it's not right in the mix to begin with. Make sure that they don't try to compete for the same space. There's judicious ways you can do that, but it's best to just make sure that they're not competing too much and one's not completely overriding the other. Because sometimes if it's balanced right, I can usually use that and emphasize or de-emphasize the kick drum over the bass and vice versa in the master if I believe it really needs to be done. It gives me that much more affordability to flex just a little bit in that deep low end. Do balance your S's and T's, your vocal S's and T's, sibilants, with your cymbals. And what I mean by that is that your drum cymbals, one, should not be crisp and clear and the vocals be dull. Vice versa, you don't want some extremely hard S's and T's in the vocals and for the drum cymbals to be completely rounded off on the top end and sound like they're behind a wall. If there are too many S's and T's that are just very sibilant in the vocals, then trying to correct that in mastering sometimes will be at the detriment to the cymbals. Make sure your vocal levels are reasonably inside the mix. There's a condition that I call the karaoke syndrome. And what this means is that the vocal is so important to the artist that they want that vocal to be heard absolutely clearly as possible, but the music is so far down in level that the vocal kind of stands on top of the mix and it's not really in the mix. In karaoke bars, largely you hear the vocal very, very loud, but the music system that the DJ brings in is often not powerful enough to make the music sound like it's also in the room, like there's a live band. There's no way to do that. And so that's why I mentioned this here, is you want the band to sound as if it's in the same room as the vocals, that they are all in the same live performance instead of somebody singing over a song. Generally, what a lot of artists can do, or what a lot of clients can do, is send me a vocal up and a vocal down version. This happens throughout the industry and it's happened for decades. But this is only to be cautious in the fact that if the vocal is subdued a little bit when the mastering engineer is adding some compression or limiting or whatever, even EQ, that the vocal starts lowering in volume as a result of that, then you have a vocal up mix that can be used instead, and that brings the vocal back up to an acceptable level. Be careful with high pass filtering, even low pass filtering. To give you an example, a singer is recording a vocal track while there's a screen or a pop filter in front of the vocal between the singer and the microphone, the vocalist is stomping on the ground slightly, or they're just holding the mic stand, there might be a little bit of rumble that appears in the vocal track, and you want to get rid of that. And sometimes high pass filtering is a great way to do that. But be careful you don't rob the vocal of enough low end so that it has a good low end presence. Believe it or not, some vocals can reach down to 80 hertz. That's low, but anything below that, yeah, absolutely. Feel free to high pass filter that, but don't high pass filter up to like 300 hertz, 400 hertz. You know, you don't want that, right? And finally, don't dither your mix. At any point, there's no reason to do it. There's a function that dithering has, and I think a lot of people don't fully understand it, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's hard to understand without a primer. But in my free ebook, I do cover dithering to some degree and kind of explain it in a way that may help you understand what it's for, but it's only helpful if it's done just once. Outside of that, it just becomes extra noise added to the mix, and when it comes into mastering, we're now mastering that noise that was created by the dither, and it's not necessary. So don't dither. Do send reference mixes. If you've got a baked mix or a cooked mix that you're sending out to your clients as a mix engineer or the producer or the artist, and they're listening to this and they're loving it because it's cranked up, it's loud, it's smashed, it sounds even hyper compressed, don't worry about that, but send me that reference mix because I will have a reference to what everybody else is listening to. And that's a great way to master because then I know what really appeals to their ears. But chances are maybe I can do a little bit more judicious or decisive compression to make it compete even better. And that's one of the key points of mastering. Send me reference mixes from other artists, masters that are in playlists and masters that are on CD, but anybody who you believe your music would fit in best with in the same playlist or on a CD compilation. Send me those masters and I can use those to understand better about what direction you want your masters to go in when it's mastered.